Hi everyone. This is a little expose on things that are considered pseudoscience and what we can glean from them. I don't just mean that people are gullible and they'll believe anything. Those aren't questions that challenge us. People tend to gravitate towards certain popular ideas, so that whenever you bring up a subject, the response is, "That's just baloney pudding. You've been eating crazy beans with a cross-eyed sailor." The more something is considered taboo, the more people are pressured not to share what they've seen or know. Someone will post on this thread saying the examples I give are all things science has disavowed and this nonsense needs to be silenced. It's interesting how people who feel strongly about something don't know they've been compromised. Divisiveness leads people to think the conclusions you make are what makes you smart or ignorant. Bill Nye is a scientific spokesman who chooses to debate people over the existence of Noah's Ark, where one person shares his talking points and then the other person sticks to his talking points, so there are no common facts. Is a scientist just someone who plays ball for science so we can defeat these bastards? Or is it someone who questions everything in front of them, including their own institutions? I think a smart skeptic should want to be friends with a smart theologian, and then the two of them could choose some really interesting questions and find something they agree on. Here are some examples. Bill Nye speaks publicly against religion and also people who have seen UFOs, as if those are two things a respectable scientist doesn't believe in. Well, in today's world, UFOs aren't fuzzy old photos anymore. They're testimonies from all these government whistleblowers, which has become an open barn door that used to be tightly closed. One of these recordings is a 1958 interview by Mike Wallace of an Air Force colonel who says, even at that time, UFOs were such common knowledge among pilots, aeronautical engineers, and all his military buddies. It required a massive suppression campaign, which makes it a phenomenon within the scientific community. So if you're a skeptic, you're disputing someone who was an engineer for the CIA for 10 years, or you're disputing that he was an engineer or that his lab existed. And yet, after all this time, Bill Nye thinks it's some fuzzy photos, presumably because he hasn't seen or doesn't wonder about classified material. Listen to what this Air Force colonel gives as the reason this information was kept from the public in 1958. It was first that they were afraid of hysteria. Then they were also afraid that it would upset organized religion. Wikipedia says pseudoscience is often characterized by contradictory claims, reliance on confirmation bias rather than rigorous attempts at refutation, lack of openness to evaluation, and absence of systematic practices when developing theories. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms one's pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. So what happens when it is mainstream scientists confirming their own pre-existing beliefs to discourage attempts to refute it or disguise that other scientists have been using systematic methods? I'll put it a different way. What happens when you find yourself on the other side in one of these situations? Use of vague or exaggerated claims, absence of progress, personalization of issues. These are all things that could be applied to any discovery. Let's take absence of progress, for example. The recent observation of two neutron stars colliding was hailed as a huge scientific achievement because it confirms Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. An astronomer could just as easily say this is something we already knew, that it actually occurred in the distant past, and the day we discovered it is random, arbitrary, and insignificant. A sign of how slow we are in confirming these theorems. And that astronomically, whether something confirms one man's theorem isn't what matters. What's significant about it is how it affects other people. Scientists want to confirm things for their audience because they have competition. These are much more advanced questions than just saying people who believe certain things are stupid. Pondering the stupidity of people who disagree with you itself raises an interesting question, which I think makes things more complicated. I call it, what would you do if you had to debate someone who is mentally retarded? If a source is considered dubious, does that mean there are no facts in it? Here's another one. Is something taboo because it is unscientific or just unpopular among scientists? If everyone was in agreement, conversations would be very easy. One might say pointless. So why not challenge yourself? I asked my friend recently what he was thinking about, and he said, Bigfoot and the stupid people who believe in him. He was referring to a sighting in McDowell County, North Carolina, this past August, where a man named John Bruner, who was specifically looking for Bigfoot, says he stood face to face with one and got a good look at it. Now, my friend is right that anyone can say this happened. It's very inconvenient that he didn't have a camera with him. But then my friend says, if Bigfoot exists, there would be some kind of physical evidence for it. Now, when something is disputed whenever it's mentioned, evidence tends to disappear. When a farmer uncovers some bones that shouldn't exist, he just buries them again so people don't start talking about him. Or a soldier who comes forward saying he shot and killed one during a training exercise and was told never to say anything about it. Now, it's impossible to know whether a lost specimen was authentic or not, but human behavior can be studied. The people who think something doesn't exist are the ones who are afraid of it. So we're not going to ask why people are acting this way? I thought this behavior was common knowledge, just as my friend thought the idea of Bigfoot was a non sequitur, a creature from folklore. So I could have gone off and sat on a rock with these thoughts, and he could have sat on a rock with his thoughts, and the discussion is over. A similar impasse takes place in the whole I'm batting for science, you're batting for theology debate, which makes it appear that those two things are mutually incompatible and we must choose between them. Something can be two things at once. For example, the argument, scientific facts are proven, therefore science is not apolitic, is a lie. It can be both. There's a recording of some of the top professors of philosophy in Europe discussing what makes something real or not. The first one says, there's a glass on this table. I can see it and feel it, therefore it's real. That's not entirely true. Even if you didn't know it was there, it would still be real. Whether we know it or not is irrelevant to the fact. So what the two sides of this debate can agree on is that whatever is, instead of saying, there is no God because my knowledge makes it so. And through this, the realization that if someone who disagrees with you is pursuing what is true, you have to respect it. Ravi Zacharias, who is one of the most intelligent theologians of our time, has written Platonic-style dialogues between Christ, Buddha, Mohammed, and other figures, and he speaks mainly to university audiences all over the world because that is where most intellectuals are to be found. I have never quoted him before because, frankly, his arguments are so good, I'm not able to retain and repeat them well enough to do them justice after I hear them. So I've pared this one down for the sake of brevity. He says, the greatest challenge in your life and mine is to be truthful. And when you define truth, it has to be collaborative and coherent. One of the great temptations to intellectuals is to assume that in grasping the finger of their own discipline, they have acquired the whole fist of reality. When Bill Nye challenges people about Noah's Ark, he is grasping one finger of truth. The way you can tell someone is doing this is when they don't know there are other fingers in the grasp of reality. When I said the smartest skeptic should get together with the smartest believer, did you think, well, there isn't one? And that's what confuses what the disagreement is. It's the same as saying to an atheist, you're actually just a really bad believer because you're in my world. Not a healthy discussion between different interpretations. Here are some examples of things that are considered pseudoscience. I've chosen ones that aren't usually among the top 5 pseudosciences because it's necessary to give examples that are safe, just as it's necessary to make jokes. Because the first thing people want to know is whether it's an approved or unapproved subject, to know if their mind is already made up, which makes it impossible to learn something. Number 1, alternate history. Harry Turtledove is the master of the alternate history genre. Basically, there is a rumor that various people over the years have claimed to remember the US Civil War ending differently than history books tell us. The claim is that basically the South had better generals, and they lost due to a series of mishaps, like Stonewall Jackson getting shot in the back in his own camp, or Lee's invasion plans getting stolen by a spy and delivered to the North, which sound like things one person with some foreknowledge could do. Now, I've always been taught the South didn't have a chance. They didn't have the industrial capabilities of the North and so on. So this made me think, does military strategy and wisdom come from the way battles happen to go instead of the other way around? In other words, if Napoleon had won the Battle of Waterloo, would we be saying, "Of course he did. Look at what a skilled commander he was"? But all someone has to do is ask, what's the source of this information again? And the possibility is discarded. Example number 2, mountain lions. Here is an article on something called the Eastern cougar, which was written to convince people that cougars, which once existed east of the Mississippi River, are now extinct, and therefore the many sightings reported each year are either escaped pets or western cougars that have wandered out of their range. The thing is, there is no such subspecies. It's a name that was invented because of the controversy. This article says, there is no objective evidence for the presence of cougars since the last century anywhere in eastern Canada or the eastern United States outside of Florida. Numerous sightings have been reported in Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, as well as one that was hit by a car in Connecticut in 2011. One has to ask, why is this controversial? And the answer is, the people most likely to encounter cougars are hillbillies unable to get a DNA sample, which is a difficult burden of proof for an animal that is often glimpsed. Mark Dowling, who investigated many of these reports, says that they were highly influenced by the Bigfoot factor. If you think something is ridiculous, it becomes a factor. This article also doubts the likelihood that lions wandered all the way from their breeding grounds in the Dakotas. Cats don't have a breeding ground. They mate whenever they see another cat. It's a strange thing to be arguing. Example number 3, the vaccine debate. I was starting to think this wasn't a good example. So convincing is the argument for vaccines. But it's a perfect example of a debate that is entirely one-sided. If you have a child who suddenly developed a strange medical disorder after receiving a vaccine, all doctors who are credible, upstanding humanitarians believe the vaccine couldn't have been the cause. and all those who disagree are nefarious, which creates an interesting convenience. Vaccines are necessary to combat diseases. If there were side effects, it would be bad. We don't want there to be any evidence of this. Someone's going to post, no study has shown any connection between vaccination and autism, because of how important it is to maintain this message. Let me say that again. The importance of vaccines is the reason people are convinced, and anomalies are the reason people are unsatisfied with these explanations. Is it possible for intelligent, well-meaning experts to say something that isn't true? Example number 4, astrology. One of the most interesting quandaries in science is that if men like Isaac Newton had never been born, the science of physics might not exist as we know it today. Now, you could say that other individuals would eventually discover the same laws. We all look at the same moon. We're all affected by gravity and so forth. But if you don't believe in predestination, you have to consider what some of the more extreme scenarios might be. Astrologers were at one time the only scientists, but it's hard for people to wrap their brains around the idea that it might have advanced instead of science to the present day. If you could meet someone from that civilization, they might say to you, "Oh, you drive a Taurus? Research proves that April is the best month for making cars." But we only know astrology as something that hasn't changed in 2,000 years, while science is a way of life. So we'll never know. In closing, I'd like to ask if there are examples we can't learn anything from, such as the theory that the moon landings were faked. I don't want to be guilty of the "that's ridiculous" argument. Whether something seems ridiculous to us or not is not an objective observation. But it's hard to give them the benefit of the doubt. It's like being an investigator who has to interview imperfect witnesses. It's no longer a question of whether facts meet certain scientific standards, which are actually customs, or whether facts are valid when the question is, are they welcome? Thanks for listening. If you think anything I've said was thought-provoking, post a response. Ciao.